So, we pick up where we left off yesterday with the Cold War looming throughout the world, particularly between us and the Soviet Union. And as if that wasn't enough, we're going to pile to that list. So, the next couple of lessons actually take place in that period of time of the 40s into 50s, 60s, 70s, and we'll wrap it up with the 80s. Woohoo! So, if you remember, we've covered something called the Red Scare before. And so, as communism is rearing its ugly head again, we're having a new Red Scare. So no new label, just know it's happening, people. And so unfortunately, the first probably major event that we're going to discuss that has to tie into the Cold War, even though it wasn't with the Soviet Union directly, it definitely had to do with the Soviet Union's power and the idea of the spread of communism, which is all wrapped up in the Cold War. So today's main topic is war in Korea. So I apologize in advance. We're going to go through it quickly, keep it straightforward to the meat and potatoes of the whole topic, but I don't mean to diminish the significance of the war itself. We're just in a time crunch at this point in the year. So with that, I'm sorry, my mouse is giving me a little issue here today, so we're moving slow. Here are a couple locations you should know, most of which you're probably familiar with. China. If you didn't know where Korea was, we've talked about it enough. There's north and south right there. Japan right next to it. Taiwan, Soviet Union, well, that whole area, the United States, you best know where that is. South Pacific, that entire region where basically we were fighting World War II. Egypt, which here's a better map to show you since you'll have to label it on a map that barely showed it before. The Suez Canal and a little conflict we're going to have. I skipped Israel. So that was Israel, then the Suez Canal, then Britain, and then Parlez-vous français? So with that in mind, the first thing we need to address, here is North and South Korea, neighboring China there. So I don't know if you're familiar with the war, but the big thing you always hear about with the Korean War is the 38th parallel. In fact, they talk about it in the news all the time because there's kind of the little strip there where there's like a small, I guess we call it a neutral, peaceful territory dividing Kim Jong-un and South Korea. You know, there was a big deal when Donald Trump crossed this line and they shook hands in the middle and tears in everyone's eyes and hooray. So nonetheless, the 38th parallel is literally the geographical line. You know how we do like the latitudes and longitudes and so on. So it's literally the geographical line that separates North Korea and South Korea, which happened to be divided after World War II. So tying into the Cold War, the Soviet Union had control over North Korea after World War II. And of course, South Korea tried to say non-communist. I don't really even know what government to label them as because they weren't like a perfect peaceful nation by any means, but South Korea was non-communist, North Korea was communist and controlled by the Soviet Union. So in June 25th, 1950 even, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and basically that's where the war is going to kick off. When North Korea crosses that border there, the United States, with the backing of the United Nations, that's a very important point we'll bring up again, with the United Nations backing, we go in to support South Korea. So how did the outcome of China's civil war affect the U.S.'s response to North Korea's attack? Well, basically on October 1st, 1949, the People's Republic of China created a concern that communism would spread to other Asian countries. They eventually supported North Korea in their fight. So they kind of backed the idea of North Korea invading South Korea and spreading communism. And yes, China was, even though it has a kumbaya, fabulous little name there, it was a communist nation. So what were the actions of the Korean conflict? So I'm going to break it down in 7 steps. Again, I apologize for the simplicity of the war, but here's my 7-step rule to what the Korean War was like. So step 1, the North invades the South. Step 2, the United Nations and the US joined together to invade Korea. So this was almost like a universal agreement that North Korea was in the wrong to invade South Korea. Very, very important. Number 3, basically, North Korea drives us all the way down to the southern tip. And I think I put a map in here. So North Korea was doing very well, drives us all the way down to the south. Surprise attack in the north. So we had our awesome commander there helping us out, and he does a surprise attack in the north. Step 5 in my 7-point plan is that China helps the North. So now we're adding more color to this topic because now it's just not North versus South or North versus the United States and UN, but China decides to help them out, which certainly complicates the issue, which brings us to number 6 in my 7-point plan. MacArthur, the Major General, you might remember him from World War II, was kind of in charge here during the Korean War. He wanted to invade China now that China is getting involved. And this ends up being a huge controversy between him and Truman because President Truman did not agree with that. He did not want to start, another major war by involving a huge country like China. And we'll talk about that in a second. Number 7, it all comes to an end with a ceasefire in 1953. So there were 3 years of war. Now, again, I do want to just highlight this was an extraordinarily brutal war. The history behind it is devastating and sad. Unfortunately, I feel it does definitely get overshadowed in history because you always hear more about, say, Vietnam or the other big wars, but not to take Korea lightly at all. So what actually happened with MacArthur? Like we just mentioned, basically, there was a disagreement. MacArthur thought that we should have attacked China for getting involved in this conflict. And, that's not such a horrible thing, but when Truman went against MacArthur and insisted, as president, commander-in-chief, he insisted that we not go against China, MacArthur made some very public statements about Truman. Something along the lines of, he's wrong, he doesn't know what he's doing, name-calling kind of a thing. With that, MacArthur gets fired from his position. So again, this was a huge to-do. And the big question is, do you agree, do you disagree? Was MacArthur right? Did he have every right to say that? Was Truman right? Should he have fired him? And so this, was big news in the newspapers and so on and so forth. So you can make your own decision. Was MacArthur right? Was Truman right? Or I don't know. You decide for yourselves. All right, next thing. Why did a second Red Scare occur in the late 1940s and 50s? And again, same as the first time around, it was just the fear of the spread of communism. This time around, however, it was even more public. It was even more fearful. The first time around, it was almost under the radar. This time, it was literally in the United States' faces because so many countries were getting taken over and it's affecting global freedoms. Also, the idea of spies coming into the country, on top of the fact that we now have media, right, with the radios and everything, where this information was getting out to the public easier. So people were getting more scared about it, which brings up a term, McCarthyism. Now, this has been thrown in the media today because of a lot of the controversies we have in politics today. They've thrown this term McCarthyism out there to tie into some of the name-calling and tattletaling and lies or not lies that get told in our politics today. So if you've ever heard the term, this is where it comes from. There was an actual senator in the Senate, Washington, and his name was Joseph McCarthy, and he was totally against communism, which majority of Americans would have been behind. The problem is McCarthy was calling out a lot of people, a lot of politicians for being communists. Even though he had no evidence for it, he kind of just started disparaging all of these people's reputations, even though he had nothing to support the idea. So if this sounds similar to anything you've heard in the news today, you can gather where the McCarthyism idea is getting thrown around even in today's media. So he was making accusations without any kind of proof, and he increased his visibility to the public through all of the media outlets, which will eventually cause his downfall because he almost became too public a figure with his accusations. Which brings us to my next question. How did Eisenhower deal with the Cold War? So now Truman's out, Eisenhower's in, and so I don't have a good comic for Eisenhower, but I thought it was cool when I was searching for some, I found these that would be more relatable. So the magic word that comes out with Eisenhower is he wanted to address the Cold War with something called brinkmanship. B-R-I-N-K, manship. So go to the brink of war to prevent the spread of communism and the evil ideas that the Cold War could continue. So as you can see, this brinkmanship idea is something that gets tied into other presidents as well, like sitting on nuclear weapons and how fearful that is, JFK's fingers on the button. We've talked about this topic numerous times this year, so going to the brink of war to prevent our controversy, which still lingers with North Korea. So brinkmanship, magic word, Eisenhower, that was his political philosophy for the Cold War and his presidency. So this is a huge topic. We're only going to touch on it. I hope some of you researched it for your research papers because it's fascinating. Tied into the Cold War was something that you guys probably are familiar with, known as the space race. So on top of communism, which of course was the bigger idea, this fear of who was going to control space and have the other newer technologies that were getting developed was like a huge competition between us and, yes, you guessed it, the Soviet Union. So how can you tell that the launch of Sputnik, which by the way was the Soviet Union, how do you know it was a big deal? Well, because we responded immediately by coming up with our own satellite, and our government set up NASA, which, to be honest, during your younger years didn't even exist. It's kind of sort of making a comeback now, but this was a huge government thing with the whole idea of satellites and spaceships and sending somebody to the moon and big government program. On the bottom here, you see a little Friends video about Sputnik that I'll include for you as well in Google Classroom, so feel free to enjoy. Here we go. Why do you think the United States and Soviet Union were able to cooperate during the Suez Crisis? So the Suez we've talked about previously this year. It's this canal that was a really important transport, whether for military, trading, whatever, in the Middle East. And so there was a huge conflict here, which we actually had nothing to do with, and neither did the Soviet Union, but both of our allies did. So we didn't engage in it because it was actually a conflict between other countries. So we did not want to get involved. So for example, we were going to come in and support Great Britain. But again, it wasn't really worth a war with the Soviet Union, and it was indirectly involved with us. So we stayed out of it, which was a very good choice. And here's just like a quick little wrap up of some of the things we did or did not mention. So some events that were happening in the world. Obviously, during this time period in Asia, the Korean War was huge. Soviet Union, they started to train military to prepare North Korea to invade South Korea. They were testing atomic bombs. And of course, aside from Sputnik continuing their information search to controlling outer space, and this tied into the whole fear of communism, spies, all of that. The United States helped South Korea with, of course, the UN's backing, which is a big deal. We also had the CIA in Iran and Guatemala because of communism and the fear of that spreading. And then just miscellaneous category, China came in to help North Korea, the Suez conflict with Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt, which again divided us in terms of wanting to help the Soviet Union or not. So with that, guys, there's your quick throw out of some of the main details of the next decade, the 1950s, the Korean War. As per usual, any questions, let me know, and just answer the questions to prove you listen to my fabulous voice, and have a great day. Miss you. Bye.